The land out here did not offer comfort. It offered truths, hard and sharp as the stones that littered the ground. Wyoming in the 1870s was a place of vast, aching emptiness, a canvas of bleached grass and sun-cracked earth stretched taut between horizons. The wind was a constant sermon, whispering of loneliness in the summer and screaming of death in the winter. It scoured the paint from the few buildings that made up the town of Redemption, and it scoured the hope from the faces of the people who lived there. At night, the coyotes sang a lonesome chorus to a bone-white moon, their cries echoing the hollow spaces in a man's heart. Everything, from the gnarled cottonwoods by the creek to the faces of the townsfolk, was weathered, cracked, and burned by a sun that gave light but no warmth. It was into this crucible that Sarah walked. She came not on a horse or in a wagon, but on her own 2 feet, a ghost conjured from the swirling dust of the plains. She was in her late 20s, but the miles and the grief had carved years into the delicate lines around her eyes. Dust clung to the hem of her dark dress, caked her worn boots, and settled in a fine powder on her eyelashes. In one hand, she clutched the handle of a frayed satchel that held everything she owned in the world. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were guarded, revealing nothing but a deep and abiding weariness. She was a woman running not towards something, but away from the whispers that had grown into shouts, away from the sideways glances that felt like stones thrown at her back, away from the memory of a small, cold hand in hers and the rumor that she had put the poison there herself. Redemption was not a big town. It was a single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a livery, and a boarding house that looked as tired as she felt. As Sarah walked the length of that street, a silence fell in her wake. Women stopped sweeping their porches to stare, their eyes narrowed with a cold, assessing curiosity. Men leaning against the saloon's facade lowered their tin cups, their conversations dying in their throats. The whispers started before she even reached the boarding house, a rustle of speculation that followed her like her own shadow. The woman at the boarding house door was broad and formidable, her face a mask of stern piety. She took one look at Sarah's dusty form and the haunted look in her eyes. "No rooms," she said, her voice flat, before Sarah had even spoken a word. "I can pay," Sarah said, her voice a dry rasp. She did not want charity. She had learned long ago that charity always came with a price. "I said, no rooms." The woman's gaze was unflinching, a judgment delivered without trial. "We've heard about you, the woman from Laramie, the one with the sick child." The words struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She recoiled, a flicker of pain crossing her features before the weary mask fell back into place. She did not argue. She did not protest her innocence. She had learned that, too. Protests were just kindling for the fires of gossip. She simply nodded, turned, and walked away, the weight of 100 accusing eyes pressing down on her. The general store refused to sell her so much as a loaf of bread. The liverymen pretended not to see her when she asked about work. Redemption had closed its doors to her. She was an outcast, a pariah branded by a story that had traveled faster than she had. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the vast sky, another traveler arrived. This one came on a fine-boned mare, a creature of elegant breeding that was as out of place here as the woman on its back. Mary Beth was a stark contrast to Sarah, where Sarah was faded and worn. Mary Beth was a splash of defiant color, even in her disheveled state. Her riding habit, though torn and mud-splattered, was made of fine southern wool. Her hair, the color of spun gold, had escaped its pins and tumbled around her shoulders in a wild cascade. But there was a frantic, desperate energy about her. Her eyes, a startling blue, were wide with a hunted fear. A dark stain of blood seeped through a makeshift bandage on her forearm, a long, angry gash that looked too clean to be an accident. She had fled on her wedding night, a southern belle from a world of verandas and mint juleps, promised to a man of wealth and reputation. She had discovered, in a moment of sickening clarity, what that reputation was built upon. Her fiancé, a man whose smile never reached his cold eyes, had made a different kind of arrangement for her future. Her life was to be a transaction, her body an asset to be leveraged in a house of ill repute, a gilded cage where she would entertain his associates. The discovery had shattered her world. In a panic, she had done the only thing she could think of. She had fled, taking nothing but the horse and the clothes on her back, creating a wound on her arm as a pretext for any who might question her sudden departure. Marybeth, too, found no welcome in redemption. Her fine clothes and panicked demeanor marked her as an outsider of a different sort. They saw not a lady in distress, but a problem, a disruption to the hard-won, fragile peace of their town. She was turned away from the boarding house with the same cold finality as Sarah. As night fell, a man in the saloon, smelling her desperation and seeing her beauty, made a lewd suggestion. Marybeth, her pride and fear warring within her, slapped him hard across the face, the sound cracking like a whip in the tense silence. The incident only solidified her status as trouble. It was a stooped old man, sweeping the porch of the general store, who finally offered a sliver of direction, if not hope. He had watched both women be rejected by the town. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Town's got no room for folks with stories," he mumbled, not looking at them. "Only one place left to try. Man out on the edge of the valley. Jack Carter, keeps to himself. Might shoot you, might help you. No telling with a man like that." And so it was that two women, fleeing from different ghosts, found themselves walking the same path out of a town that wanted no part of them. The track led to a small, isolated ranch nestled in a hollow, shielded from the worst of the wind by a low rise of hills. The cabin was sturdy, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the twilight air. A man stood by the corral, his back to them, his shoulders broad and powerful under a worn chambray shirt. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, his hands sure and steady as he mended a leather strap. He turned as they approached, and they saw the man the old-timer had spoken of. Jack Carter's face was like the land itself, weathered and carved by harsh elements. A thick, dark beard covered a square jaw, but it could not hide the grim set of his mouth. His eyes were the color of faded denim, and they held a deep, profound sadness, a sorrow that seemed as old and vast as the plains. He looked at the two women standing before him, one a picture of faded grief, the other a portrait of frantic defiance, and his expression did not change. Sarah spoke first, her voice quiet but clear. "Sir, we were told you might have a roof. We can work. We can pay." Marybeth, standing a few feet behind her, said nothing, but her chin was held high, a posture of pride that was at odds with the terror in her eyes. Jack's gaze moved from one to the other. He was a man who had come west to be alone, to outrun the thunder of cannons that still echoed in his memory. He had not sought company, and he did not want complications. But in these two women, he saw something familiar. He saw the look of someone who had been cornered by the world, the same haunted expression he sometimes saw in the mirror. He saw survivors. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. Finally, he gave a short, reluctant nod. "One of you can take the cot," he said, his voice a low gravel. "The other can have the floor by the fire. You work, you eat, you cause trouble, you leave. That's the bargain." He did not ask for their stories. He did not want to know their names. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving them to follow. The door creaked open, revealing a sparse, clean interior, and the three of them stepped out of the vast darkness and into the small, charged silence of a shared room. The tension in the cabin was a living thing, as thick and palpable as the winter cold that was beginning to seep through the log walls. Jack was a man of routine and silence. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet and efficient as he stoked the fire and made coffee. He gave them chores with clipped, single-word commands. Wood, water, mend. He divided the labor as he had divided the space, giving them separate tasks, separate corners, ensuring they orbited around him but never collided with each other or with him. Sarah, accustomed to hardship, took to the work with a quiet resignation. She chopped kindling with a steady rhythm, her movements economical and practiced. She mended Jack's torn shirts with small, neat stitches, her head bowed, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Mary Beth, however, chafed under the new reality. Her hands, soft and uncalloused, were clumsy with the axe. She struggled with the weight of the water buckets, her pride stinging with every stumble. She had been raised to arrange flowers and command servants, not to haul water and scrub floors. A silent resentment simmered within her, directed at Jack for his stoic indifference and at Sarah for her quiet competence. Jack spoke little to either of them. He would eat his meals quickly, his gaze fixed on his plate, and then retreat outside to the endless work of the ranch. He was a man hiding in plain sight, his body present but his spirit somewhere far away. Sometimes, Sarah would see him pause in his work, his eyes staring at the distant horizon, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. She recognized the look of a man haunted by something he could never leave behind. He was a soldier, she guessed, though he wore no uniform. He carried the battlefield inside him. The days bled into one another, each one a careful dance of avoidance in the cramped space. The women learned the sounds of each other's breathing, the rhythm of each other's movements. They knew, without looking, where the other was at all times. They were two poles of a magnet, repelling each other, yet bound by the invisible forces of their shared confinement. Then the snow came. It began not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent onslaught. The sky turned a bruised, leaden gray, and the wind began to howl, a mournful, shrieking cry that clawed at the cabin. Snow fell in a thick, blinding curtain, erasing the horizon, the corral, the entire world outside their small shelter. For 3 days, it did not stop. The wind rattled the shutters and moaned down the chimney. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The enforced proximity was a torment. The silence, once merely awkward, became heavy and suffocating. There was no work to be done outside, no escape from the presence of the others. Cabin fever began to set in, a slow, creeping madness. They sat for hours, listening to the storm rage outside and the louder storm of unspoken thoughts raging within. Glances were exchanged over the rim of a coffee cup, in the flicker of the firelight, wary, assessing, sometimes hostile. The small space crackled with unspoken words, with resentments and fears and a strange, burgeoning curiosity. Sarah would watch Mary Beth pace the length of the small room like a caged animal, her movements filled with a restless, frustrated energy. She saw the ghost of a different life in the proud set of Mary Beth's shoulders, the defiant tilt of her chin. Mary Beth, in turn, watched Sarah's quiet stillness, mistaking her resignation for weakness, her silence for judgment. And they both watched Jack. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, focused movements, his face an unreadable mask. But the storm seemed to agitate the ghosts within him, too. The faraway look in his eyes was deeper, his silence more profound. On the 3rd night of the storm, the fragile dam of control finally broke. They had eaten their meager dinner of salted pork and beans in the usual tense silence. The wind shrieked outside, a sound like a woman screaming. Suddenly, Sarah made a small, choked sound. She dropped her fork, and it clattered loudly on the wooden table. She pressed her hands to her face, and her shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. Mary Beth froze, staring at her, a flicker of alarm in her eyes. Jack looked up from the fire, his expression still, but his eyes were fixed on Sarah. The sobs grew louder, a torrent of grief and despair that could no longer be contained. It was the sound of a heart breaking, of a spirit that had been pushed past its limit. "I did not kill my son," she whispered, her voice ragged and broken. The words came out in a flood, a confession born not of guilt, but of a desperate need to be heard. He was born with a weak heart. The doctors said he would not see his first winter. He caught a fever. His breathing, it just stopped. She looked up, her eyes swimming with tears, her gaze moving frantically between Jack and Mary Beth. But they started talking. The midwife whispered that I had seemed tired of caring for him. Another said I had bought rat poison for the barn the week before. They said I wanted to be free. They looked at me. They all looked at me like I was a monster, a murderer. Her voice broke completely. Everyone treats me like I am a murderer. The cabin was utterly silent, save for her ragged breaths and the howling of the wind. Mary Beth looked down at her hands, a complex emotion on her face, pity mixed with a strange, uncomfortable sense of her own. Different kind of shame. Jack Carter did not move for a long moment. He looked at the weeping woman, at the raw, undeniable truth in her agony. He had seen men die. He had seen liars and heroes, cowards and killers. He knew the look of truth when he saw it. He rose slowly from his stool and walked to the table. He stood over Sarah, a large, intimidating presence. He reached out a calloused, work-roughened hand and gently, hesitantly, placed it on her trembling shoulder. "I believe you," he said. The words were quiet, but in the small, silent room, they resonated like a gunshot. It was a simple touch, an anchor of human connection in a sea of despair. But Sarah, who had not known a kind touch in so long, flinched as if she had been burned. Her body went rigid, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with a wild, cornered fear. From her corner of the room, Mary Beth watched the entire exchange. She saw Jack's quiet act of comfort. She saw Sarah's flinch, and in that moment, a sharp, unexpected pang of jealousy shot through her. It was a hot, bitter feeling that she did not understand and immediately despised herself for. She wanted that comfort. She wanted that belief. She wanted his hand on her shoulder. She looked away, staring into the dancing flames of the fire, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She said nothing, letting the silence and the storm swallow the moment whole. The snow melted as grudgingly as it had arrived, receding in dirty patches to reveal the bruised and battered earth beneath. The world outside the cabin returned, vast and silent. But the world inside had been irrevocably altered. The storm had passed, but the emotional tempest it had unleashed lingered in the charged air between the three occupants. Sarah's confession, and more importantly, Jack's quiet declaration of belief, had shifted the very foundations of their cohabitation. The silence was no longer one of mere avoidance. It was now a space of cautious thought, of unspoken questions. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself on the ranch. The work was hard and relentless, a constant battle against a land that gave nothing easily. But now, the women worked not as reluctant servants, but as participants. They were earning their keep, but they were also carving out a space for themselves, proving their worth in ways that had nothing to do with their pasts. It was in this daily toil that their true natures, long buried under layers of grief and fear, began to emerge. Mary Beth, the former Southern belle whose hands had known only needlepoint and piano keys, discovered a surprising and profound connection with the animals. There was an uncanny knack to her, a way she had with the horses that even Jack, for all his strength and experience, could not replicate. When a young colt shied from the bridle, snorting and wild-eyed, Jack would approach with grim determination, a battle of wills. Mary Beth would approach with a soft, murmuring voice and a hand held out not to conquer, but to soothe. She moved with a confident grace, her voice a low, calming melody, and the animals responded to it. They seemed to sense that she, too, was a creature of high spirit and nervous energy, and they trusted her. She was sharp and intuitive, reading their moods in the flick of an ear or the twitch of a flank. For the first time since she had fled her gilded cage, Mary Beth felt a sense of purpose, of competence. She was not just a runaway bride. She was the woman who could calm the wildness in a horse's heart. Sarah, in turn, found her purpose in healing. Her hands, which the world had accused of dealing death, were instruments of incredible gentleness and care. When a calf gashed its leg on a strand of loose wire, it was Sarah who cleaned the wound with practiced, steady fingers. Her touch was impossibly light, her voice as soothing to the frightened animal as Mary Beth's was to the horses. She knew which herbs to boil for a poultice, which roots to grind for a fever. She moved about her tasks with a quiet, focused grace, her past as a caregiver, a mother, resurfacing not as a source of pain, but as a source of skill. She was mending things, not just the torn flesh of animals, but the torn fabric of her own identity. In tending to the wounds of others, she was tending to her own. Jack watched them both, his face as impassive as ever, but a new light in his sad eyes. He had expected them to be a burden, a temporary complication. He had not expected them to become a part of the ranch's ecosystem, to fill roles he did not even know were empty. He saw Mary Beth's fire and Sarah's stillness, and he began to see them not as their stories, but as who they were. Slowly, cautiously, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. The change was not sudden, but gradual, like the erosion of a canyon wall. It started with small things. He began to linger over his coffee in the morning, listening to the quiet sounds of the women preparing for the day. He started answering their questions with more than a single word. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin warm against the chill of the night, Sarah looked at him, her gaze direct and unafraid. "You ever think of going back east?" she asked, her voice soft. Jack stared into the flames for a long time before he answered. "There is nothing to go back to." Mary Beth, sensing a crack in his armor, pressed gently. "Your family." A shadow passed over Jack's face, a flicker of a deep and ancient pain. He picked up a small piece of wood and began to whittle at it with his knife, the shavings falling like teardrops onto the hearth. "I had a brother," he said, his voice low and rough. "Eli. He was younger than me, full of life. He thought the war was a grand adventure." Jack's hand stilled, the knife resting on the wood. "We fought at Shiloh. The noise. I have never heard a silence big enough to drown out that noise. I saw him fall. I carried him off the field myself. He died in my arms." He did not look at them. He kept his eyes on the fire, but they could see the memory playing out in the depths of his gaze. "My parents died of grief a year later. They said it was influenza, but it was grief. I came west after that. I thought if I went far enough, I could leave him behind, but he is here every night when I close my eyes. His body was a fortress of muscle and sinew, built for hardship and labor. But in that moment, they saw the truth of him. His spirit was exhausted, worn thin by a grief he had carried alone for too long. He was a man not just hiding from the world, but from a ghost. His confession was a bridge. It spanned the chasm of silence that had separated them. And in the following nights, the women began to walk across it. Emboldened by his vulnerability, they started to share their own. Late at night, with only the crackle of the fire for company, they spoke of the lives they had lost. Mary Beth described the suffocating elegance of her southern home, the slow poison of a society that valued a woman's purity above her soul. She spoke of her fiancé, of his cold ambition and the horrifying discovery of his plans for her, her voice trembling with a rage that was still fresh. Sarah, in turn, spoke more of her son, of his sweet smile and the terrible, helpless feeling of watching him fade away. She recounted the whispers, the way her friends and neighbors had turned on her, their suspicion a more fatal poison than any she had been accused of using. As they shared their traumas, a fragile understanding began to grow between them. They were different in every conceivable way, one a fire, the other still water, but they were both survivors of a world that had tried to break them. A bond formed, woven from the threads of their shared pain. But beneath the surface of this growing camaraderie, another, more complicated feeling was taking root. It was an unspoken competition, a quiet rivalry for the attention and approval of the stoic man who had given them sanctuary. He was the sole source of masculine energy, of protection, in their isolated world. And unconsciously, they both began to vie for his favor. The simmering tension came to a head one evening in late spring. Jack had been out on the range for 2 days, branding new calves with a hired hand from a neighboring ranch. He returned at sunset, slumped over in his saddle, his face pale and slick with sweat. He slid from his horse and staggered toward the cabin, his body racked with shivers despite the mild evening air. He had a fever. It burned through him with a terrifying intensity, leaving him delirious and weak. The women did not hesitate. The rivalry, the jealousy, it all evaporated in the face of this new crisis. They became a team, moving with a fluid, unspoken coordination. Marybeth, with her surprising strength, helped him into the cabin and onto his bed. Sarah was already at the hearth, boiling water and crushing herbs. Together, they worked to bring the fever down. They bathed his forehead with cool cloths, their movements synchronized. They forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips. It was the first time either of them had touched him with deliberate tenderness. Their hands, one soft and uncalloused, the other gentle and healing, moved over him with a quiet, focused care. They were no longer just the women he had taken in. They were his nurses, his protectors. In his vulnerability, the power dynamic of the cabin shifted completely. He was no longer the silent, stoic authority. He was simply a man, helpless and in their care. In the depths of his fevered sleep, he began to mutter. The words were disjointed, fragments of memory from the battlefield. He cried out for Eli. He spoke of fire and smoke. And then, his voice softened, became almost a caress. Eleonora, he whispered, the name a sigh of longing. Eleonora, I am sorry. The two women froze, looking at each other over his sweat-soaked body. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost more real and more threatening than any they had brought with them. Who was Eleonora? A wife, a sweetheart, a casualty of the life he had left behind. Neither of them recognized the name, but it instantly haunted them. It was a piece of his past, a door to a room in his heart that was closed to them. A new, sharper jealousy, this time shared, pricked at them both. Jack's fever broke 2 days later. He recovered slowly, his strength returning in small increments. But he was changed. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He remembered, through the haze of the fever, the feeling of their hands, the sound of their soft voices. He remembered their tireless care. He had been alone for so long, nursing his own wounds in solitude. To be cared for, to be touched with such tenderness, had moved him in a way he did not have the words to express. When he was strong enough to ride again, he did something entirely out of character. He saddled 3 horses. "Come on," he said, his voice still rough. "There is something I want to show you." He led them up into the hills that sheltered the ranch, along a narrow, winding trail. He took them to a place he had never shown anyone, a small, hidden meadow that overlooked the entire valley. The view was breathtaking. The harsh, unforgiving plains they saw every day from the cabin door were transformed from this vantage point into a sweeping panorama of profound and rugged beauty. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. A hawk circled on a thermal high above them, its cry a lonely, wild sound. The air was clean and cool, scented with pine and damp earth. And the meadow itself was a riot of color, a tapestry of Indian paintbrush, wild bluebells, and yellow daisies. They stood there in silence for a long time, the 3 of them, side by side. He had shown them a part of his world that was not about survival, but about beauty. It was a gift, an acknowledgement of what they had done for him. It was his way of saying thank you. The fragile peace of that afternoon was shattered that night. The shared experience, the glimpse of beauty, had stirred something in all of them. The tension, which had been dormant during his illness, returned with a new, sharper edge. After their meal, Jack went outside to check on the horses. Marybeth, her heart pounding with a reckless, impulsive energy, followed him. She found him by the corral, his back to her, staring up at the star-dusted sky. She walked up behind him and, without a word, put her hands on his shoulders and turned him to face her. Before he could react, she stood on her toes and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry claiming. It was all of her pent-up frustration, her fear, her loneliness, and her burgeoning desire poured into a single, frantic act. For a moment, surprise held him motionless. Then, his hands came up and he firmly, but not unkindly, pushed her away. "Mary Beth, do not," he said, his voice low and strained. The rejection was a physical blow. Humiliation washed over her, hot and sharp. She stared at him for a heart-stopping second, her blue eyes wide with hurt and anger. Then she turned and fled back to the cabin, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. The next evening, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Mary Beth was sullen and withdrawn. Jack was grim and silent. He had been chopping wood and had misjudged a swing, the axe glancing off the log and opening a shallow cut on the back of his hand. After dinner, Sarah brought out her box of salves and bandages. She sat beside him at the table, the lantern casting a warm glow on their faces. She took his large, calloused hand in hers. Her touch was the complete opposite of Mary Beth's. It was gentle, hesitant, almost reverent, as she carefully cleaned the wound. Her fingers brushed against his palm. A current of warmth, simple and profound, passed between them. He did not pull away. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she wrapped the bandage with an expert's care. When she was finished, her hand lingered on his for a fraction of a second too long. He did not move. He did not speak, but he did not pull away. The breaking point came a few nights later. Another storm had rolled in, this one of rain and wind. Sarah was standing by the window, staring out into the churning darkness. Her shoulders slumped. The anniversary of her son's death was approaching, and a wave of grief, raw and overwhelming, had washed over her. Jack saw it. He walked over to her and, just as he had done during the snowstorm, he placed a hand on her shoulder. This time, she did not flinch. She leaned into the touch, a silent, grateful acceptance of his comfort. Mary Beth saw the gesture from across the room. She saw the quiet intimacy of it, the way Sarah leaned into him, the way his hand rested on her shoulder. She saw the gentle comfort he offered so freely to Sarah, the same man who had pushed her away. It was more than she could bear. A strangled cry escaped her lips. She jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I cannot do this," she choked out, her eyes flashing with a mixture of rage and unshed tears. She threw open the cabin door and ran out into the lashing rain and wind. For a moment, Jack and Sarah stood frozen in shock. Then, with a muttered curse, Jack went after her. He found her in the barn, her back pressed against the rough-hewn wall, her body shaking with sobs. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors. "Mary Beth!" he shouted over the storm. She spun to face him, her face a pale oval in the gloom, streaked with rain and tears. "Leave me alone!" she cried. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his patience finally snapping. "Running out into a storm like a mad woman? What is wrong with me?" she shot back, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "What about you? You push me away, but you touch her like she is made of glass. What is she to you? A charity case? A broken bird you can mend? This has nothing to do with Sarah." He roared, the sound echoing in the cavernous space of the barn. "It has everything to do with her!" Mary Beth screamed, taking a step toward him, her fists clenched. "You see her pain, but you are blind to mine. Do you have any idea what it is like to be so alone you feel like you are screaming, but no one can hear you?" Her words struck him like a physical blow. In her rage, in her desperate, aching loneliness, he saw a reflection of his own. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of shared despair. The anger between them had just been a shield, a noisy defense against the vast, silent emptiness that threatened to consume them both. He took a step toward her, his face taut with an emotion she could not read. The space between them crackled. He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip hard, almost painful. He stared down at her, his eyes blazing in the dim light, and then he lowered his head, and his mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness or affection. It was a raw, frantic claiming, a desperate attempt to silence the storm that raged both outside and within them. It was a collision of two lonely, desperate souls. His hands moved from her shoulders, tangling in her wet hair, pulling her closer, her arms wrapped around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. The argument turned into something more, something elemental and wild. There in the dark, dusty confines of the barn, with the scent of hay and rain and the thunderous sound of two hearts beating as one. The aftermath of the storm in the barn was a deafening silence. The rain softened to a steady drumming on the roof, and the wind died to a low moan. But inside the cabin, a new, jagged tension had taken root. Marybeth and Jack returned separately, both soaked to the bone, their faces pale and unreadable in the flickering lamplight. Marybeth went to her corner without a word, her movements stiff, while Jack added a log to the fire with a hand that was not quite steady. He would not meet Sarah's questioning gaze. In the days that followed, the air was thick with things unsaid. A current of unspoken history now flowed between Marybeth and Jack, and Sarah, acutely sensitive to the emotional weather of their small world, felt it like a change in barometric pressure. She did not know what had transpired in the barn, but she knew it had been a cataclysm. Marybeth carried herself with a new, brittle pride. It was a feverish, fragile triumph, the victory of a starving woman who has finally snatched a piece of bread, only to find it tastes of ash. There was a possessive glint in the glances she threw at Jack, a subtle claim laid, but beneath it, a bitter tang of guilt soured her victory. She would watch Sarah's quiet movements, her gentle hands as she kneaded dough or stitched a seam, and a wave of shame would wash over her. She had acted on an impulse as wild and raw as the storm, and now she had to live in the quiet wreckage. Jack was a man adrift. The control he exerted over his land, his animals, and himself was the bedrock of his existence. In the barn, that control had shattered. What he had done felt less like an act of passion and more like a raw, animal act of mutual desperation. He was ashamed of his weakness, ashamed of the violent hunger that had overtaken him, and deeply ashamed of how he had used Marybeth's pain to momentarily soothe his own. He became even more silent, his words clipped, his movements rigid. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, trying to exhaust the confusion and guilt from his body, but it clung to him like the dust of the plains. Sarah felt the distance from both of them. Marybeth, once a rival, was now a stranger hiding a secret. Jack, the man whose quiet belief had been a lifeline, now seemed 1,000 miles away. A profound loneliness, deeper than any she had felt since her arrival, settled over her. She retreated into herself, her silence a protective shell, her heart aching with a sorrow she could not name. The breaking point came nearly a week later. The three of them were sitting by the fire after supper, trapped in their customary silence. Jack was oiling a piece of harness, his focus absolute. Sarah was mending one of his shirts, her needle moving in small, even stitches. The simple domesticity of the scene seemed to mock Marybeth's inner turmoil. She could not bear it another moment. "Sarah," she said, her voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. Sarah looked up, her expression questioning. Jack's hands stilled. Marybeth took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "I have to tell you something. It is not fair to you. This silence—" She looked at Jack, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, before turning back to Sarah. "That night of the storm, in the barn, something happened, between me and Jack." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. Sarah's needle stopped mid-stitch. She did not look shocked or angry. Her face was very still, her eyes searching Marybeth's, waiting. "We were arguing," Marybeth rushed on, the words tumbling out in a torrent of confession. "I was angry and hurt and so terribly lonely. And he was there. It was not gentle. It was like the storm." It just happened. She finally ran out of words, her gaze falling to the floor, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She waited for the explosion, for the anger, the hatred, the righteous fury she deserved. But it did not come. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was a hoarse whisper, filled not with anger, but with a profound and startling sadness. "I know," she said softly. Mary Beth's head snapped up. "You know?" "Not what happened," Sarah clarified, her gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames. "But I knew something had. I felt it." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely audible. "The truth is, Mary Beth, I am not angry with you. I am angry with myself for feeling what I feel." She took a shaky breath, the confession costing her more than Mary Beth's had. "Because I wanted it too." The admission was a second, more powerful shockwave. Mary Beth stared at her, speechless. The rivalry, the jealousy, it had not been one-sided. Sarah, the quiet, grieving widow, had felt the same desperate pull, the same aching need for comfort, for a moment of human warmth to push back the crushing cold of her solitude. In that moment, they were not rivals. They were two sides of the same coin, two women starving for the same thing. What neither of them knew was that they were not alone. Jack, having risen to step outside for a breath of cool night air, had stopped just outside the door, his hand on the latch. He had heard everything. Mary Beth's guilty confession, and then Sarah's quiet, devastating admission. The words crashed over him, a tidal wave of guilt far more powerful than anything he had felt before. He had not just lost control with one woman. His presence, his actions, had caused a deep and painful fissure between them both, forcing them into a secret, painful competition. He stepped back into the cabin, his face pale, his eyes filled with a raw, self-recriminating agony. Both women looked up at him, their own private drama interrupted. He looked from one to the other, his gaze lingering on each of them, seeing them clearly for the first time, not as complications or burdens, but as two deeply wounded people he had wounded further. "It was my fault," he said, his voice thick with shame. "Both of you, I am sorry. I never should have. Mary Beth, I took advantage of your fear and your anger. And Sarah, I have been a coward, hiding behind my work, offering you nothing but a roof." He looked down at his own hands, as if they were foreign objects that had betrayed him. "I am sorry for the pain I have caused you both." He expected anger, recriminations, perhaps even tears. He was prepared for them to tell him to leave, to demand one of them go. Instead, he was met with a silence that was different from all the silences that had come before. It was watchful, thoughtful. Mary Beth and Sarah exchanged a long, searching look, a silent conversation passing between them. A strange and fragile alliance had been forged in the crucible of their shared confession. It was Mary Beth who spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "We are all three of us lonely. Jack, we are all running from something." Sarah nodded, her gaze meeting his directly. "Your apology is accepted, but it is not just your fault. It is this place, this life. It is hard to be alone." Then, Sarah asked the question that would change everything, a question born of shared desperation and a radical, unthinkable hope. She looked at Jack, her stormy eyes clear and direct. "Do you want us both?" The question hung in the air, audacious and terrifying. It was a proposition that had no name, no precedent in the world they knew. It was an acknowledgement of the impossible, tangled knot of emotion that bound the three of them together. Jack stared at them, dumbfounded. He saw no cunning in their eyes, no trickery. He saw only a raw, terrifying vulnerability, a reflection of his own. He looked at Mary Beth's fiery spirit, the defiant pride that masked a deep well of hurt. He looked at Sarah's quiet strength, the gentle resilience that had survived unimaginable grief, and he felt the truth of it. He did not want to choose. He did not want to lose either of them. Choosing would mean sending one of them back out into the cold, unforgiving world from which they had fled. And the thought of the cabin, of his life, without one of them, left an aching void in his chest. He did not answer with words. He walked to the small cupboard where he kept a bottle of whiskey, a potent medicine for the coldest nights and the deepest aches. He poured 3 fingers into 3 tin cups and handed one to each of them. He did not sit on his stool, above them. He sat on the floor, on the worn bearskin rug between them, putting himself on their level. What followed was not a seduction, but a slow, cautious exploration. The whiskey burned a trail of warmth through them, loosening the last of their inhibitions. For a long time, they just sat, the 3 of them, a strange trinity in the flickering firelight, sipping the potent liquor. The silence was no longer tense, but charged with a fragile, electric anticipation. Marybeth, ever the bold one, was the first to move. She reached out and rested her hand on his knee. It was a simple gesture, but it was a tectonic shift. Jack did not flinch. He covered her hand with his own. A moment later, Sarah, sitting on his other side, reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Her touch as light as a sigh. He was anchored between them, between the fire and the water, the storm and the calm. He turned his head and looked at Marybeth. Her eyes were dark with emotion. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the frantic hunger of the barn, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness, an apology and a promise in one. She answered with a fierceness that was tempered by a new, trembling vulnerability. Then he turned to Sarah. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears. He lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. He leaned in and kissed her with an aching softness, a reverence for the grief she had carried for so long. It was a kiss of comfort, of healing. Touches turned into whispers, whispers of past pains, of present fears, of a fragile, burgeoning hope, and the whispers turned back into kisses, passed between the 3 of them, a slow, circular current of warmth and acceptance. They were navigating an uncharted territory of the heart, without a map or a compass, guided only by the magnetic pull of their shared loneliness and a desperate, dawning need for one another. The first shared night was a crossing of all boundaries, an act that the world outside would have condemned as a mortal sin. But in the small, isolated cabin, under the vast, unjudging sky, it felt like a sacrament. It was sensual, yes, but it was also cautious, reverent, and deeply emotional. It was about the simple, profound comfort of warm skin against theirs, the solid weight of a body next to them in the dark. For Jack, it was the first time in years he had not felt the ghost of his brother beside him in the bed. For Sarah, it was the first time she had been touched with desire since her husband's death, a confirmation that she was still a living, breathing woman, not just a vessel of grief. For Marybeth, it was the first time a man's touch had felt like a safe harbor rather than a transaction. It was the profound, earth-shattering relief of being seen, truly and completely, in all their brokenness. For all 3 of them, it was a feeling they had never known before, the feeling of belonging. The next morning, a fragile, shimmering vulnerability hung in the air. They dressed in silence, avoiding each other's eyes, not out of shame, but out of a kind of sacred shyness. Something profound had shifted. It was more than lust, more than the simple sating of a physical need. It was the quiet comfort of being known, of being accepted, flaws and all. The world had been reduced to the 3 of them, and in that reduction, they had found a strange and powerful kind of freedom. Later that day, after the morning chores were done in a new, softer silence, Jack saddled the horses again. He did not say where they were going. He led them away from the meadow, further into the property, to a place where the land flattened out on a small rise overlooking the creek. There, nearly hidden by overgrown grass, was a foundation of field stones, the ghost of a house that had never been built. A pile of weathered silvered lumber lay nearby, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. He dismounted and stood in the center of the stone outline. The women dismounted and came to stand beside him. "I started this a few years after I got here," he said, his voice quiet. "I met a woman in Laramie, a schoolteacher. Her name was Eleonora." The name, the ghost from his fevered dreams, was finally given a face. She was kind. She made me think I could have a life again. A normal life. I was going to build this house for her, ask her to marry me. He kicked at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. "I went into town to see her, to ask her, and I saw her with another man, the town banker. She was laughing. She looked happy. I realized then that I could never give her a life like he could. I was a man with ghosts and calloused hands. I had nothing to offer a woman like that. I turned around, rode back here, and I never went back. I never touched another stone on this foundation." He looked out over the valley, the same view he must have imagined sharing with another woman. He looked at Sarah and Mary Beth, his two unexpected, impossible partners. "I thought I would die alone out here," he said, the words a final, complete surrender of his solitude. Mary Beth stepped forward and took one of his hands. Sarah stepped forward and took the other. They stood there, the three of them, on the foundation of his abandoned dream. "You will not," Sarah said, her voice full of a conviction that left no room for doubt. "No," Mary Beth echoed, her grip tightening on his hand. "You will not." The world began to thaw, and with the melting snow, the carefully constructed privacy of their lives began to erode. The secret of Jack Carter's ranch, once locked away by winter, was now a story carried on the wind. A lone trapper, passing through the valley on his way to trade furs, saw two distinct female figures hanging laundry on a line, one with hair like spun gold, the other dark and still as a shadow. He mentioned it at the saloon in Redemption. A neighbor, riding the fence line in search of a stray steer, saw Jack working alongside both women, the three of them moving in a rhythm of comfortable familiarity. That story, too, found its way to town. Like all stories passed through the filter of small-town gossip, this one twisted and grew monstrous in the telling. The reclusive, battle-scarred rancher was no longer just a recluse. He was a keeper of a private harem, a man of dark appetites. The two women were not survivors seeking shelter. They were fallen women, harlots, preying on a lonely man's weakness. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a den of iniquity, a stain on the moral fabric of the burgeoning territory. The first official sign of the world's intrusion came in the form of Sheriff Brody. He rode out to the ranch on a fine spring morning, the silver star on his chest glinting in the sun. He was a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, with a damp, knowing smile that never reached his small, cold eyes. He claimed it was a routine check-in, a matter of keeping tabs on the residents in his jurisdiction, but his eyes roamed over Mary Beth's figure and lingered on Sarah's downcast face, and the lie was plain to see. "Heard you had some company out here. Carter," Brody said, leaning against a corral post, feigning a casual air. "Mighty charitable of you, taking in strays." Jack stood straight, his body a rigid line of defiance, his face carved from stone. "They earn their keep." "I am sure they do," the sheriff said, his tone thick with a greasy insinuation. He let his gaze drift toward the cabin. "Must be a cozy arrangement, two handsome women all to yourself. A man could get to thinking you are running a business out here that is not related to cattle." A low growl rumbled in Jack's chest. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the sheriff, his hands hanging loose at his sides, but every line of his body screamed danger. "You came out here to say something, Brody, so say it, but you choose your next words carefully. They might be your last." The sheriff's smile faltered. He had known Jack Carter for years as a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself. He had never seen this cold, lethal fire in his eyes. Brody was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward at heart. He pushed himself off the post, holding up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Just making sure everything is on the level. Carter, that is all. We have got statehood talk coming down the line. We need to present a decent, God-fearing face. The territorial government does not look kindly on unorthodox living situations. He swung himself up onto his horse, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked down at Jack, his confidence returning with the advantage of height. "You watch yourself. I will be back." He spurred his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in his wake. The sheriff's visit was a harbinger of the storm to come. The fragile peace of their life had been shattered. A few weeks later, their supplies ran low, and a trip to redemption became unavoidable. Jack was laid up with a twisted ankle from a fall, so the task fell to the women. They rode into town together on the wagon, a united front against the world. The moment they arrived, they felt the change. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased as they passed. Curtains in windows twitched. The air grew thick with a hostile, palpable judgment. They were a spectacle, a living embodiment of the town's most salacious gossip. They entered the general store, their shopping list in hand. The proprietor served them, but his movements were stiff, his face a mask of disapproval. A group of women clustered by the fabric bolts fell into a pointed silence, their eyes following Sarah and Mary Beth with a cold, condemning stare. It was as they were leaving the store that the simmering hostility boiled over. A man, his face flushed with whiskey and self-righteousness, stumbled out of the saloon. His name was Jedediah Stone, a man known for a cruel tongue and a weak will. He saw Sarah, and his eyes narrowed with a vicious, drunken glee. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "It is the merry widow of Laramie. Heard you got a taste for poison. Is that what you are using to keep that rancher in your bed? Or is he just happy to take a murderer under his roof?" Sarah froze, the bag of flour in her arms suddenly feeling as heavy as lead. The old accusation, the one she had run so far to escape, struck her with the force of a physical blow. She paled, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted pain. She tried to walk past him, to ignore him, but he stepped into her path. "What is the matter?" he taunted, leaning in close, his breath sour with liquor. "Cat got your tongue? Or did you poison that, too?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Then he stooped down, picked up a small stone from the street, and tossed it. It struck Sarah on the shoulder with a dull thud. It was not a hard blow, but it was the final indignity. A small, choked cry escaped Sarah's lips. Before anyone could react, a flash of gold and fury erupted beside her. Mary Beth, her face a mask of cold rage, dropped her own parcels. She did not scream or cry. She moved with the swift, deadly grace of a striking snake. She stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her, and swung her fist with all the force of her pent-up frustration and fierce, protective loyalty. Her knuckles connected with Jedediah Stone's jaw with a sickening crack. The man staggered backward, his eyes wide with stunned disbelief, a trickle of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. He had not expected the pretty one to have a punch like a mule kick. The street, which had been watching with silent amusement, erupted into chaos. Someone shouted. A woman gasped. Jedediah, his pride wounded more than his jaw, lunged for Mary Beth, and then Jack was there. He had seen the commotion from the end of the street where he had been hobbling to the blacksmith's. Ankle be damned. He moved with a terrifying speed, his face a thundercloud of black fury. He grabbed Jedediah by the collar and threw him backward with such force that the man crashed through the saloon's bat-wing doors. The saloon emptied out, friends of Jedediah looking for a fight, others just looking for a spectacle. A full-blown brawl erupted in the middle of the street. Jack, despite his injured ankle, was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his fists striking with the brutal efficiency of a man who had learned to fight not for sport, but for survival. It was over almost as quickly as it began, ending with the arrival of Sheriff Brody, who seemed to materialize out of the dust with an air of smug satisfaction. He had been waiting for an excuse, and they had just handed him one on a silver platter. He ignored the drunken townsfolk. He ignored the bloodied Jedediah Stone. He walked straight to Jack, who stood panting, his knuckles raw, his arm protectively in front of the two women. "That is it, Carter," Brody said, a triumphant smirk on his face. "You are under arrest, brawling, disturbing the peace, and corrupt conduct." He took Jack by the arm. Jack did not resist. He knew it was useless. He just looked back at Sarah and Mary Beth, his eyes filled with a grim apology. Then the sheriff led him away, a prisoner of a town that had already judged and condemned him. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a landscape of despair. The house, their sanctuary, felt vast and empty without Jack's solid, grounding presence. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was a gaping wound. Sarah, who had faced down so much with a quiet, stoic grace, finally fell apart. She sank onto a stool by the cold hearth, her body racked with deep, silent sobs. It was not just Jack's arrest, it was everything. The whispers, the accusations, the stone, the fight. The world they had managed to keep at bay had finally breached their defenses and torn their fragile family apart. The safety she had felt, the first true safety she had known in years, had been an illusion. Mary Beth watched her, her own heart a cold, hard knot of fear and guilt. She knelt beside Sarah, her earlier rage replaced by a deep, aching empathy. She put her arms around Sarah's trembling shoulders, pulling her close. "It is my fault," Mary Beth whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I should not have hit him. I could not stand there and let him hurt you." Sarah shook her head, burying her face in Mary Beth's shoulder. "It is not your fault," she choked out. "It is this world. It is full of hate." They clung to each other in the twilight of the empty cabin. Two women alone against the world. Mary Beth rocked Sarah gently, murmuring soft words of comfort, trying to pour her own strength into the other woman's grieving spirit. She tilted Sarah's chin up, forcing her to meet her gaze. Sarah's face was a mess of tears and despair. Impulsively, tenderly, Mary Beth leaned in and kissed her. It was a soft, gentle press of lips to lips. A kiss meant to soothe, to comfort, to communicate what words could not. But as they held each other, the kiss deepened. It was no longer just about comfort. It was about a desperate, shared need for warmth, for life, for a human connection in the face of a cold and hostile world. It was a kiss of profound solidarity, a fusion of two souls who had nothing left but each other. They clung together, finding a strange and powerful solace in the darkness. The next day, a deputy delivered the news. A circuit judge, a severe and pious man named Hemlock, had convened a special hearing. Jack was being held in the town jail. The women rode into redemption, their faces set with a grim determination. The courtroom was a small, stuffy room, packed with the same self-righteous townsfolk who had condemned them on the street. Jack stood before the judge, his face bruised and swollen from a beating he had clearly received in his cell, but his back was ramrod straight. Judge Hemlock peered down at him over his spectacles, his face a mask of stern disapproval. "Jack Carter," he intoned, his voice dripping with moral authority. "You are a landowner in a territory that is on the cusp of becoming a great state. We are building a society here, a society based on law, decency, and Christian values. And you, sir, have made a mockery of all three." He did not speak of the brawl. He spoke of the rumors. "You have been living in a state of open debauchery, harboring two women of questionable character, corrupting the moral fiber of this community. This court finds you morally unfit to hold land under the new decency statutes being considered for statehood." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. "Therefore," the judge continued, his voice like the fall of a gavel, "you are given a choice. You will abandon this living situation. You will send these two women on their way, and you will live as a decent, solitary man. Or you will forfeit the deed to your land and be ordered to leave this county within 30 days. The judge leaned back, a smug, satisfied look on his face. He had given Jack an impossible choice. To save his home, he must destroy his family. Jack stood silent for a long moment. He looked at the judge's cruel face. He looked at the jeering crowd. Then his gaze found Sarah and Mary Beth, standing at the back of the room, He saw their fear, but he also saw their strength. He had been a solitary man for a decade, and that solitude had nearly killed him. He would not choose it again. He looked back at the judge, his bruised face set in a mask of unbreakable resolve. "I refuse," he said, his voice clear and strong, ringing through the stunned silence of the courtroom. The judge's face turned purple with rage. "Then you have made your choice. Take him back to his cell." But before the deputies could move, a new sound cut through the silence, the sound of two women walking forward, Marybeth and Sarah. Their hands clasped together in a bond of unshakable unity, walked down the center aisle. They stopped before the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Marybeth said, her voice clear and ringing with a conviction that stunned the crowd into silence. "We are not victims here. We are not women of questionable character being held against our will." Sarah stood beside her, her head held high, her fear gone, replaced by a quiet, powerful dignity. "We are free women," she said, her voice steady. "We came to Mr. Carter's ranch seeking shelter, and he gave it. He has shown us nothing but decency and respect. This man and this life, we choose it. We choose him." She paused, and her grip tightened on Marybeth's hand. "And we choose each other." The courtroom erupted. A wave of scandalized gasps and outraged mutterings swept through the room. They were not just admitting to a crime, they were proclaiming it as a virtue. They were defying not just the court, but the entire moral order of the world. The judge, his face a thundercloud, banged his gavel repeatedly. "Silence! Silence in this court!" he roared. "This display only confirms the depravity of the situation." He pointed a trembling finger at Jack. "The ruling stands. You and these women have 30 days to vacate the property. This court is adjourned." Jack was released at the end of the day. He walked the long miles back to the ranch, his body a map of the jailer's cruelty, but his spirit unbroken. He entered the cabin just as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. A cut split his lower lip, and a dark, swollen bruise was beginning to form high on his cheekbone, but he stood tall. His pride was not in the fight, but in the refusal to surrender what mattered most. The women rushed to him, their faces a mixture of relief and anguish. Sarah gently touched the side of his face, her fingers tracing the edge of the bruise. Marybeth was already at the stove, putting a kettle on to boil for warm water to clean his wounds. They moved around him in a silent, efficient ballet of care, but a heavy, unspoken dread filled the small room. After they had cleaned his cuts and he had eaten a bowl of stew, he finally spoke. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness that went far beyond his physical pain. "You should go," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Both of you." The words were a dismissal, an undoing of everything they had built. Marybeth, who was holding a warm cloth, froze, her knuckles white. Sarah, who was sitting opposite him, simply stared, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "There is nothing for you here now but trouble," Jack continued, his gaze fixed on the rough-hewn table. He could not bring himself to look at them. "They have given me 30 days. After that, this land is no longer mine. Brody will make sure of it. I can ride on, find somewhere else. But you should not have to pay the price for my choices. I dragged you into my war. You should go now, before it gets worse." He was offering them an escape, a chance to save themselves from the ruin he was facing. It was, in its own way, an act of profound love. But they had not stood up in that courtroom, defying a judge and an entire town, only to run now. "No," Marybeth said, her voice quiet but sharp as flint. She placed the cloth down and met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "Did you not hear us in that courtroom, Jack? Did you think those were just words we spoke for show?" Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her touch was firm, grounding. "This is our home now," she said, her voice steady and clear, echoing the conviction she had shown before the judge. "Maybe it is only for 30 days, Maybe it is only for a week. It does not matter. We do not run anymore. We stand with you." He looked from one to the other, at the unshakable resolve on their faces. He had tried to be noble, to protect them, but they were refusing to be protected. They were choosing to stand in the line of fire with him. A slow, painful breath escaped his lips, and for the first time since they had met him, he looked not just weary or sad, but truly vulnerable. He was not just a man with 2 women, he was a man with a family, and his family was refusing to leave him. The next morning, a new purpose settled over the ranch. It was not the grim purpose of survival, but the defiant purpose of creation. With only 30 days left, a sane man would have begun packing. Jack Carter was not a sane man. He was a man with a point to prove to himself and to the world. He walked out to the abandoned foundation on the rise, the ghost of his past with Eleonora, and he stood there, his hands on his hips. The women followed, watching him, wondering. He turned to them, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. "If we are to be driven off this land," he said, his voice ringing with a new, hard strength, "they will drive us from a home we built together. They will not take a memory from me. They will take a monument." And so they began to build. It was an act of magnificent, glorious folly, a testament to their refusal to be broken. They were not just building a house. They were building a home for a family that the world refused to recognize. They were raising a defiant fist to the sky, to the town of redemption, to the pious Judge Hemlock. The work was brutal. The weathered lumber he had abandoned years ago was heavy and unforgiving. He showed them how to use the saws, the hammers, the levels. Mary Beth, surprisingly, had a natural strength and a good eye for straight lines. She swung a hammer with a focused, rhythmic fury, each blow a strike against the life she had fled, against the men who had tried to control her. Sarah, with her meticulous patience, was precise. She measured boards, marked cutting lines, and learned to drive nails with a clean, efficient stroke, her movements as careful as her stitching. Their bodies ached in ways they had never imagined. Their hands, one once soft, the other once gentle, became calloused and strong, marked with splinters and scrapes. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their muscles screaming in protest, their faces streaked with sweat and sawdust. But with every beam they hoisted into place, with every wall they framed, something new was being built within them. Their shared labor forged a new kind of intimacy, a bond deeper than words or touches. They learned to anticipate each other's movements, to work in a seamless, unspoken rhythm. They were not just sharing a bed anymore. They were sharing a dream, a defiant, impossible dream built of wood and nails and pure, unadulterated will. The world watched. Neighbors, riding the edges of their own properties, would rein in their horses on the distant ridges and stare down at the strange sight on the Carter ranch. They saw the lone man and the 2 women, working side by side, raising the skeleton of a new home. Most of them watched with scorn, shaking their heads at the brazen sin unfolding in the valley. The story of their defiance in the courtroom had spread like wildfire, and it had hardened the hearts of many against them. But not all. One afternoon, as they were struggling to lift a heavy crossbeam, a wagon appeared on the track leading to the ranch. A woman sat on the seat, holding the reins. She was a widow from town named Martha Gable, a quiet woman who had lost her own husband in a mining accident years before. She was no stranger to the town's cold shoulder, to the loneliness of being an outcast. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the construction site. She did not say much. She simply climbed down, holding a bundle wrapped in a clean linen cloth. "I heard you folks were busy," she said, her voice soft. She held out the bundle. It was a loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm from the oven. "Figured you might not have time for baking." Mary Beth, her face smudged with dirt, looked at the woman with suspicion. Sarah, however, saw the quiet empathy in her eyes. She stepped forward and took the bread. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Sarah said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. It was the first act of kindness they had received from the outside world. The widow nodded. her gaze taking in the half-finished frame, the determined set of their faces. "The righteous are not always the loudest," she said, a simple statement of profound solidarity. Then she climbed back onto her wagon and drove away, leaving behind the scent of warm bread and a small, flickering ember of hope. That night, they did not retreat to the old cabin. The moon was full, a silver dollar in a black velvet sky, and it bathed the unfinished frame of their new home in a ghostly, ethereal light. They built a fire in the center of what would one day be the main room, and they sat together, their weary bodies huddled close for warmth, sharing the widow's bread. The house had no walls to keep the world out, no roof to shelter them from the heavens. They were exposed, vulnerable, sitting in the open heart of their creation. The stars above them were a vast, silent congregation, the only witnesses they needed. The shared labor of the day, the simple act of the widow's kindness, had stirred something deep within them. It was a night for vows, for sealing the pact they had made with their actions. The love they shared that night, under the open sky, around the bones of their new home, was different from what had come before. The frantic desperation was gone, replaced by a deep and solemn reverence. It was no longer about escaping loneliness. It was about consecrating a bond. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a vow. They were claiming this land, this structure, and each other, not in defiance of the world, but in celebration of their own truth. It was a quiet, sacred ceremony of a family being born. The days passed and the house grew, but their time was running out. One afternoon, with little more than a week left before the judge's deadline, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. It was not a single rider. It was a group, at least a dozen men on horseback, riding not with the easy gait of travelers, but with the grim, determined purpose of a posse. As they drew closer, the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels became visible. A cold knot of dread formed in Jack's stomach. This was not the sheriff. This was something worse. This was the town's self-appointed conscience, a group of vigilantes coming to deliver their own brand of justice. There was no time for discussion. They moved as one. Mary Beth ran to the cabin and emerged with Jack's spare rifle, her face pale but her hands steady. Sarah followed with the shotgun and a box of shells, her earlier fears replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Jack grabbed his own rifle from its scabbard on his saddle. The three of them stood in front of the half-finished house, a small, defiant garrison against the coming tide. The women flanked him, their weapons held with a competence born of his recent lessons. They were no longer three separate souls, three broken pieces. In that moment, they were a single, three-headed beast, cornered and ready to defend its lair. The riders pulled up just beyond rifle range, a grim collection of familiar faces from Redemption. Jedediah Stone was among them, his jaw still slightly swollen. At their head was a stern-faced rancher named Silas Croft, a man whose piety was as vast as his land holdings. "Carter!" Croft's voice boomed across the clearing. "We are here in the name of decency. You have defied the court. You have brought sin and corruption to this valley. We are here to see that the judge's order is carried out. You will leave this land now, or we will burn you out." Jack looked at the faces of the men, at their eyes, hard with a self-righteous certainty. He looked at Sarah on his right, her knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. He looked at Mary Beth on his left, her jaw set, her rifle aimed. He knew they would fight, and they would probably die, here on the foundation of their dream. And in that moment, he made a choice. He was done with fighting. He had seen enough of it at Shiloh to last 100 lifetimes. There had to be another way. He lowered his rifle. He leaned it against the framed wall beside him. He looked at the women. "Stay here," he said, his voice calm. Then, he walked out to meet the riders, his hands empty and open at his sides. He stopped in the open space between his home and the vigilantes, a lone, unarmed man facing a dozen guns. "Silas," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You can put your guns down. I have nothing to say to them." He stood there, his gaze moving over the faces of the men, his expression not of fear, but of a profound and weary pity. "This is our land," he said, his voice steady and strong. "This is our family." He paused, letting the words sink in. "There is no sin here but the one you carry in your own hearts. We have not harmed you. We have not asked you for anything. We have only tried to build a life, here in this place you call God's country." He took another step forward, his eyes locking with Silas Croft's. "You want to burn us out? You want to spill blood on this ground? Go ahead, but know that you will not be cleansing this valley of sin. You will only be proving that you never knew what decency was in the first place." His gaze swept over the other men. "If you do not like what you see here, then ride away. But I am telling you now, you can die with that hate in your hearts, but you will not bring it into my home." A tense, heavy silence fell. The men shifted in their saddles, their certainty shaken by the quiet power of his defiance. They had come expecting a gunfight, a sinner's last stand. They had not expected this. They had not expected a man to face them down with nothing but the truth. The spell was broken by an unexpected source. A man near the back of the group, a quiet farmer with haunted eyes, slowly, deliberately, lowered the barrel of his rifle until it was pointing at the ground. Jack recognized him. His name was Abel, a man who had fought for the Union, just as Jack had. He was a man who knew the cost of righteousness. Abel's simple act was a crack in the vigilante's resolve. Another man hesitated, then lowered his weapon, then another. They were not killers. They were followers, swept up in a tide of moral outrage. Faced with a man willing to die for his family, their own conviction wavered. Silas Croft looked around at his wavering army, his face turning red with frustration and thwarted rage. He held his rifle high for a moment longer, a lone bastion of hate, but the moment was lost. With a final venomous glare at Jack, he spat on the ground, yanked his horse's reins, and rode away. One by one, the others followed, a defeated procession, their righteous crusade dissolving into a shameful retreat. They left Jack standing alone in the clearing, the setting sun casting his long shadow back toward the unfinished house, and the two women who were his world. The 30 days came and went, not with the violence of an eviction, but with the quiet indifference of the land itself. Sheriff Brody never returned. The judge's order, it seemed, was a proclamation of moral authority. But the town of Redemption lacked the will or the courage to enforce it against a man who would not fight back with guns, but with a truth more unyielding than stone. The vigilantes did not ride again. Their single failed crusade had exposed the hollowness of their conviction, and they retreated into the sullen silence of their own homesteads. Months passed. The raw, splintered frame of the new house was slowly sheathed in wood, becoming a home. Summer bled into a golden, crisp autumn. The new structure did not replace the old cabin. It complemented it. It stood beside it, a testament to a new beginning, connected by a long, shared roof that covered two distinct porches. One porch faced the sunrise, off what had become Sarah's side of the house, a place for quiet contemplation. The other faced the sunset, off Mary Beth's, a place for watching the day's fiery end. One roof, two porches, 3 lives intertwined beneath it. The ranch did not just survive, it thrived under their combined care. It came alive in a way it never had when Jack had worked it alone. The land, it seemed, responded to the harmony of its keepers. The cattle were fat, the fences were strong, and the small world they had built was a pocket of prosperity in the harsh landscape. Their lives settled into a new rhythm, one of shared labor and quiet companionship. Sarah, who had been accused of taking a life, found her purpose in delivering it. She developed a preternatural skill with the birthing mares, her gentle, knowing hands guiding new colts into the world with a calm competence that was almost mystical. In the warm, hay-scented darkness of the barn, surrounded by the primal miracle of new life, She found her own absolution. The ghosts of Laramie grew quiet, their whispers drowned out by the nickering of a mare to her foal. She was not a destroyer. She was a creator, a healer, a midwife to the future of the ranch. Marybeth, the Southern belle who had once despised the dirt, now found her joy in it. She cultivated a sprawling herb garden in the protected space between the two houses. It was a riot of green, a fragrant tapestry of rosemary, thyme, sage, and lavender. She worked the soil with a fierce, loving passion, her hands, now calloused and capable, coaxing life and flavor from the stubborn earth. The garden was her answer to the ugliness she had fled, a patch of cultivated beauty and sustenance. She made tinctures for animal ailments, seasonings for their meals, and sachets of dried lavender that filled the new house with a scent of peace. And Jack, the solitary soldier, became a teacher. He took the women out to the far end of the valley, away from the house and the livestock, and taught them to shoot with a patient, methodical calm. He was not teaching them violence. He was teaching them self-reliance. He showed them how to clean a rifle until it gleamed, how to gauge the wind, how to control their breathing, how to squeeze the trigger with a steady, unhesitating pressure. He was giving them his strength, making it their own, and in their growing competence, in the way Marybeth's fiery spirit found a focus in her aim, and the way Sarah's quiet stillness made her an impossibly steady shot. He found a new kind of peace. He was no longer the sole protector. They were a formidable trinity, a family that could defend itself. The gossip in Redemption continued. Of course, it became a permanent fixture of the town's social fabric, a story to be whispered over sewing circles and saloon bars. But the whispers lacked their venomous edge now. They were tinged with a grudging curiosity, a kind of bewildered awe. No one dared to act on their judgment anymore. The story of Jack's stand against the vigilantes had become a local legend. He was still the sinner in their eyes, but he was a sinner who had faced them down without a gun. And that was a kind of power they could not understand, but had to respect. The respect was demonstrated in a surprising way during a long, dry spell late that summer. The creek on their land, fed by a deep spring in the hills, still ran clear and steady, while others in the valley were drying up. One morning, a wagon appeared. It was Abel, the quiet farmer, the veteran who had been the first to lower his rifle. His face was etched with worry. "Carter," he said, not quite meeting Jack's eyes. "My well is running dry. My cattle, they are in a bad way." Jack simply nodded. "There is a deep pool just past the cottonwoods. Bring them. Water them as you need." Abel looked stunned. He had come expecting to bargain, to beg, perhaps even to be turned away. He had not expected simple, unconditional grace. "I can pay," he stammered. Jack shook his head. "The water does not belong to me," he said. "Just see that your herd does not mix with mine." The word spread. A few other neighbors, their pride warring with their desperation, came to Jack for help. To each, he gave the same quiet offer. He did not ask for apologies. He did not gloat. He simply offered what he had. He was no longer just the town pariah. He was becoming a part of the valley's ecosystem of survival, a man whose character was proving to be as reliable as his spring-fed creek. One day in early autumn, the mail rider, a young boy on a fast pony, made a rare detour to their ranch. He carried 2 pieces of mail. One was a newspaper, weeks old, from Cheyenne. The other was a letter, addressed to Sarah, the envelope yellowed and travel-stained, the postmark from Laramie. Sarah took the letter, her hand trembling slightly. It was the first correspondence she had received from her old life. She held it for a long time, the sight of the postmark bringing a cold dread to her heart. She took it to her porch and sat in the rocking chair Jack had built for her, turning the sealed envelope over and over in her hands. Marybeth and Jack watched her from a distance, giving her the space she needed. Finally, she broke the seal. The letter was from the midwife who had delivered her son, the same woman whose whispers had started the firestorm of accusations. The script was spidery and uncertain, stained with what looked like tears. The woman wrote that she was old now, and sick, and could not meet her maker with a lie on her soul. She confessed that she had been the one to give Sarah's son a dose of laudanum to help him sleep through a painful night, a dose that, in his weakened state, had been too much for his small heart. She had panicked. She had been afraid of being blamed, of losing her livelihood, and so, when the whispers started, she had let them grow, hiding her own terrible mistake behind the town's growing suspicion of the grieving, exhausted mother. She begged Sarah for forgiveness, a forgiveness she knew she did not deserve. Sarah read the letter once, then twice. The world around her seemed to fall away. A sound, a low, wounded cry, escaped her throat. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of pent-up guilt and shame and the terrible, crushing weight of a crime she did not commit, finally being released. The tears that came were not the silent, desperate sobs of the snowstorm. They were a hot, cleansing flood, washing away the stain that had marked her soul. She cried for her son, for the injustice of it all. But most of all, she cried with the profound, earth-shattering relief of being exonerated, of her truth finally being acknowledged, even if only by the one who had condemned her. Jack and Mary Beth came to her then. They did not speak. They simply sat with her, Mary Beth holding her hand, Jack resting a large, comforting hand on her shoulder, until the last of the tears had fallen and a quiet, exhausted peace settled over her. The world had finally given her back her innocence. Later that evening, Mary Beth idly scanned the old newspaper. Her eyes caught on a small column detailing events from the East, and then she saw a name she recognized. Her former fiancé. He was dead. He had been killed in a duel in New Orleans, a sordid affair over a card game and the honor of a woman whose name the paper did not see fit to print. There was no obituary, no mourning, just a stark, one-sentence summary of a life of hollow pride ending in a pointless death. She read the line aloud, her voice flat. Jack and Sarah looked at her, expecting something, but Mary Beth felt nothing, not joy, not sadness, not even anger. She felt only a profound, quiet emptiness. The man who had been the architect of her deepest terror, the monster who had haunted her nightmares, was simply gone. He was a story in a newspaper, a ghost who had finally faded into nothingness. The last chain binding her to her old life had rusted through and fallen away. She was free. In the final, golden hour of that day, they gathered on the main porch, the one that faced the sunset. The day's work was done. The air was cool and smelled of drying herbs and wood smoke. A profound sense of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished, settled over them. Sarah sat in the middle, in a large chair Jack had built, and she leaned back against his chest as he stood behind her. Mary Beth sat on a stool at their feet, her head resting against Sarah's knees. It was a comfortable, unstudied tableau of their new reality. The sun was a fiery orange ball, sinking below the horizon, painting the vast, empty prairie in hues of breathtaking beauty. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the colors fade. They were not hiding anymore, not from the world and not from themselves. They had built a home not just of wood, but of acceptance. They had forged a family not of law or convention, but of a love that was as wild and resilient as the land itself. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, Jack leaned down. He pressed a soft, gentle kiss into the crown of Sarah's dark hair, a kiss of profound tenderness and comfort. Then, he reached down, and Mary Beth tilted her head back to look up at him. He leaned further and kissed her firmly on the lips, a kiss of passion and fire. The sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars pricked the darkness. From the distant hills, a lone coyote called, its voice a high, haunting melody. Another answered, and then another, until the air was filled with their song. It was the music of the wild, the anthem of their home, a family, not defined by law, but by love, sat together as the coyotes began to sing. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from. So we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.